you're all here tonight to hear from Maddie Miller about the future of the Twin Cities locks and dams. The Army Corps of Engineers is doing a disposition study looking at the locks and dams at the Lower St. Anthony Falls and also at Ford Parkway, and are actually considering the possibility of even dam removal or changing ownership. And if you can imagine how that would change, habitat, water quality, but also some of the recreational use of the Mississippi that we do, this is going to be really interesting to hear about. Maddie works as a grassroots organizing coordinator for the Friends of the Mississippi, and she does a lot with community members and partner organizations to advocate for the health of the Mississippi and for its future. So welcome, Maddie, and you can take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much again for having me here today. I'm really excited to be talking with you all about this issue. So like Fran was saying, my name is Maddie, and I am the Grassroots Organizing Coordinator with Friends of the Mississippi River. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the future of the Twin Cities locks and dams. I'll also note at the end, I'll answer as many questions as needed and things like that. But if there's anything pressing or anything that kind of comes out throughout, please feel free to stop me or let me know if, sound or anything like that goes off. So with that, I'll get started. So just to really contextualize this issue, we have 3 locks and dams in the Twin Cities metro area. So first, we have this Upper St. Anthony Falls Lock and Dam, which is where we have that waterfall right in the middle of downtown Minneapolis and this really large lock right next to it. Then we have Lower St. Anthony Falls, which is just a little bit downriver of that, which is a much smaller lock and dam. And then also a lot less access to it as well. So it's usually one that folks kind of forget about. And then we have Lock and Dam number 1, or the Ford Dam, kind of right between the Highland Park neighborhood and Minnehaha Creek Regional Park and everything that's right over there, kind of by like the Waban picnic area and all of that stuff. So you can see Ford Parkway, the bridge right there. So those are the 3 locks and dams kind of in the Twin Cities area. Lower St. Anthony Falls and Lock and Dam number 1, or the Ford Dam, are the only ones that are being studied right at this time. So just to clarify that, it's only these 2 that are being studied together that we're going to be focusing on, but their history and why we're talking about this today is very deeply intertwined with Upper St. Anthony Falls, which I'll get into a little bit more, but just to clarify that too, Lower St. Anthony Falls and Lock and Dam number 1 are the ones being studied right now by the Army Corps. So really what's driving this question and what we're thinking about at this time. So Friends of the Mississippi River doesn't yet have a stance on what we think the outcome of the study that the Army Corps of Engineers is doing on the locks and dams. So we are really focusing on this big question of what is our 21st century vision for the river? These locks and dams were constructed and redone and things like that at a very different point in history where the river was used for far more industrial and commercialized purposes than they are now. And so we don't yet have a stance on what we think should happen. We've been doing a ton of public engagement. We talked to over 800 folks in the last 6 months, actually, in the Twin Cities area about this issue, to really have people's questions and comments and concerns really drive a lot of the work that we're doing, so we can also be more informed by the public's opinions and thoughts and ways that they interact with the river, so that as we kind of progress with the study and learn more about this issue too, we're able to keep a lot of that in mind and a lot of those relationships too, as we continuously approach this question, as we eventually will have a stance on the issue. So how did we get here? Now I'll dive a little bit more into the history of all of these things. So the Ford Dam was built in 1917, getting its namesake from the Ford Motor Company's their manufacturing plant that they set right next to this lock and dam in order to use the hydropower to provide energy to the plant. And so that's where that whole area and why that name and everything is sitting right there, and why it's so commonly known as the Ford Dam. Ford no longer operates there. They still, I think, have some ownership over some of the buildings there. I'll point it out when we get to some of the later images, but still have some ownership of some of the areas there and leases and things like that. But there's no longer a manufacturing plant. They actually have that really big, if any of y'all are from the Highland Park neighborhood, the really big development project that's going on where the plant used to be with all the apartment buildings and things like that. So the Ford Motor Company closed down a while ago, but this lock and dam is still being used for hydropower. And so Brookfield Energy is a Canadian energy company that's leasing from the Army Corps in order to basically generate the hydropower and sell it back to the grid. So lock and dam number 1 was built in 1917 by the Army Corps. Ford had a lot of ownership and use of it, and then they are no longer there anymore. I think they closed in about 2015. Lower St. Anthony Falls and Upper St. Anthony Falls were put in a little bit later in the 50s and 60s. They, of course, Minneapolis wanted a piece of St. Paul's economic commercialization of the area and the way that they were using the river. And so Upper St. Anthony Falls, of course, has been used and has been dammed and used for lots of different purposes for hundreds of years at this point. But more recently, the locks and dams were reconstructed and redone in the 50s and 60s. All of these locks and dams were constructed with the purpose and intention of facilitating commercial navigation. So moving barges and materials up and down the Mississippi River. This stretch of the river used to look incredibly different. It used to be a lot more difficult to navigate. And so putting the locks and dams in essentially turned the river into a staircase. And we have these, long pools in between each of these locks and dams so that a ship can come in, the lock doors open, you go in and the water level raises so that you're up on the other side of the dam. And it's a much smoother, stagnant flow of water. That's a lot easier for navigation. That all changed when Upper St. Anthony Falls lock closed to prevent the spread of invasive carp into the headwaters of the Mississippi River. And so Minneapolis never really reached the economic success that they were projected to that really commissioned the Army Corps to build the locks and dams. And so closing the lock itself essentially rendered Lower St. Anthony Falls and lock and dam number 1 obsolete for any barge traffic or commercial navigation, just because there's nowhere to dock in between lock and dam number 1 and Lower St. Anthony Falls. So with that, all 3 of these locks essentially are only used now for recreational traffic. And if that, a very small amount at this point in time. So that's a really major part of this, that Upper St. Anthony Falls, there's no boats going through that lock anymore. And so the very limited traffic that does go through the Lower St. Anthony Falls and lock and dam number 1 locks are just for recreational traffic and some tour boats and things like that. But another thing to note is these were not built with the purpose of flood control or hydropower, anything like that. This was really just for navigation. So this is an example of what St. Anthony Falls or Owamni used to look like before the locks were put in. So this is actually the only naturally existing waterfall on the Mississippi River that's as large and to this scale, which is a really unique and significant part of the river. And you can also see there were islands and things that were just very, very different than the way that they are now. It made it much more difficult for navigating. Here you can see a picture of the Lake Marshall Bridge, I think from the late 1800s. This one as well, you can see kind of islands spread out and a lot more shoreline expanding into the river, where it looked very different in that way and had effects that made it a lot harder for barge traffic to get through this area. So that brings us to kind of where we are right now in the process. Like I was saying, since Upper St. Anthony Falls closed to prevent the spread of invasive carp, Lower St. Anthony Falls and Lock and Dam number 1 serve little to no boat traffic at this point. And so that has essentially instigated what is called a disposition study by the Army Corps. So since those are not being used for commercial navigation or their intended purposes anymore, the root of the word disposition is to dispose of. So to shift ownership or basically just to see what to do with these structures anymore, since the Army Corps doesn't necessarily want to hold on to them if they're not being used for their intended purposes. And so really what the goal of that study is to examine the costs and benefits of federal projects like these that are no longer serving that authorized purpose. Upper St. Anthony Falls actually went through this process a few years ago. They started it. It is not finished. The recommendation that the Army Corps made to Congress was to sell it to a private entity, which would have essentially privatized our drinking water, which no one wanted and had a lot of public pushback. And so that recommendation has not been completed and that study has not been finished. And that is why these two locks and dams are being studied together, and why it is also so important that we are so involved in this process right now to make sure that, you know, we're really driving the outcome of this process, and the public gets to have a say on what not just our interaction and understanding of our relationship with the river is right now, but what it's going to be for people also, you know, 100 or 200 years in the future. So with that, we're going to do a little quiz just to make sure we're all on the same page. Can anyone tell me what the primary intended purpose of Lower St. Anthony Falls and Lock and Dam number 1 is? Either unmuting or just in the chat too is great.
Navigation.
Perfect. Thank you. So just to recap, it's not for flood control and it's not just for the purpose of hydropower. These were built for navigation for commercial barge traffic and things like that. So that brings us to the disposition study itself. Essentially, what the Army Corps will do is go and do this study of what those costs and benefits are for these structures, and then they're going to make their recommendation to Congress. There are about 3 potential outcomes for those recommendations. And in all honesty, there's so many different possibilities that can fall under these as well. So I understand that this can get a little bit confusing, and there's so much room for creativity and different options and things like that we just don't know at this point, but are things that we're cognizant of at this time. So the first potential outcome would be that the structures remain under Army Corps ownership. So not a lot changes, but the Army Corps would do the study and decide that it is in their best interest to continue maintaining and operating them the way that they are. That's probably the least likely outcome of this, just because it's pretty costly just to continuously maintain and operate these structures when they're getting very little traffic at all. I'm not sure if many of you are on the river that often, but if you've tried to kind of paddle this stretch of the river, the hours are incredibly inconsistent. The locks aren't open. Some people have had to just check Facebook and things like that. And it's not been very consistent to be able to get through the lock itself when you're on the water. The next option is that the structures could be transferred to a new owner or owners. So this is the one that has a lot of different possibilities. It could be someone who wants to keep the structures in place, like the energy company who wants to utilize it for hydropower purposes. It could be someone like a local municipality or a recreational service or something like that. It could also be a nonprofit organization. We do a lot of partner work with American Rivers, who has done a lot of different dam removal projects throughout the country, who could, form a trust or raise enough money to choose to remove these structures. There are a lot of possibilities with what could happen if the Army Corps decides to sell it. They could also sell it to a tribal nation. They have a different community engagement process with tribal nations and things like that. So it is possible that someone could step forward and decide that they want to take ownership of these with the intention to remove or keep them, and then transfer some of that land and some of those titles and things like that in a lot of ways, which is very interesting to think about as a land back situation. Either way, whenever or if these structures were to be transferred into private ownership, we as the public would lose a lot of say over what were to happen and with the maintenance and operation of these structures as well. We're not entirely sure who would want to continue to operate the lock besides the Army Corps, but it's a possibility. It's something that, we're considering at this time. The third option would be dam removal, that the Army Corps could do this study and decide that it is in their best interest to actually remove these structures. So they can make this recommendation to Congress. And their estimates are usually pretty high cost-wise for dam removal by the Army Corps, but this could get transferred to another kind of entity within the federal government to be commissioned to take out these structures. So that's something that we're really, really interested in, because that would be a huge change for the river. So with that, I'm going to jump into some of the considerations that come with dam removal, because this outcome would very clearly have some of the most tangible and physical changes to the way that we understand the river at this time. The first would be ecological considerations. So the restoration of river rapids and rare habitat that's in the stretch of the river gorge, with the return of those islands and things like that, different fish, like native fish populations and mussels, and then the ways that those are interconnected with birds and plants and insects and things like that, we would have a very different river structure at this time. And dam removal and the way that that would be restored would have to be very designed. And we have a lot of records for what the river used to look like and how it used to flow and things like that. But this is something we're really interested in because of its ecological benefits. Dams are generally not very good for the health of rivers, because it essentially in this area wiped out so much of that very rare habitat that fish were dependent on the oxygen in the rapids for spawning and food and things like that, and the way that it impacted water quality was huge. And so it's really interesting to think about a lot of the ecological work that could be done with dam removal. The next would be recreational changes. This is one that has a lot of different potential pros and cons with it. I'm not sure if many of you are rowers, but rowing and things like that would change a lot, essentially, if the dams were taken out. The water levels would drop really significantly and expose a lot more of the shoreline and things like that, where almost the more lake-like structure that you have right now in these parts of the river wouldn't exist anymore. And so many rowers would likely need to relocate where they do their practices and things like that. On the other hand, this is also a really big question of access. And so folks that maybe don't have the ability to get onto the river right now, maybe could have increased ways to get onto the river in the future with more shoreline and different ways to interact with the water. So there have been discussions about, tubing in some areas, or whitewater rafting, or other recreational activities that at this time aren't as possible or feasible in this type of river environment. And so we recognize that, that's really hard for a lot of different communities who are really dependent on the river in the way that it is now. But it's something that we're also cognizant of, that, this is a really big question of accessibility and how different people interact with the water. And it's something that we're really interested in talking to more folks about, what they think is the best for their community's relationship to the river. Next would be infrastructure. One of the major parts of this is there's never been a dam removal of this scale in an urban area in the country. And so we have a lot of infrastructure that is dependent on the way the river is now. That's not to say that any of it would necessarily be immediately jeopardized, but it's something we want to have studied. So it could be things like stormwater drains, bridges, retention walls, things like that. We want to make sure that everything that is really dependent on the river gorge structure is going to be considered in this study. There's also the parts of the loss of hydropower, where that's being generated at the dams right now. I will say we haven't been considering that as much as a deal breaker in this consideration, just because dams, hydropower itself is a renewable resource, but dams themselves are pretty harmful for the environment just because of the way they affect the habitat in that ecosystem. And so the hydropower itself is something that we want to make sure is replaced with other forms of renewable energy like wind or solar. This is all to say also that we are cognizant of whatever the cost might be of this. And we know that it's very possible this could be an incredibly expensive project, but it's something that we also want to have studied. Sorry, my throat gets so dry from talking through this presentation, so bear with me. So one of the major questions that we've gotten as we've talked about this is that it's, what would that look like? What would dam removal look like? It's really hard to visualize because so many of us have only known the river in this way. Our partner, the National Parks Conservation Association, has taken on that challenge actually, and they have produced visualizations of what the river would look like if these structures were removed. So here you can see Lock-in Dam number 1. This red roof building is what I was talking about with generating the hydropower for the Ford plant. And then you have the bridge here. And this is what it could potentially look like if the Ford Dam were taken out. So you can see these big islands. If any of you are familiar with that area, you've seen that one island as water levels have lowered throughout the summer and into the fall, how it's popped up and a bunch of trees and vegetation has been kind of sitting there, and it was not there in May. So that was something that we've been really interested in, seeing some of those differences. And then there'd be a lot more shoreline to kind of get onto the water. Next, we have Lower St. Anthony Falls. And then this is what it could potentially look like with some more of those rapids and shoreline and things like that. So that brings us to where we are right now. The first step in this process is called scoping. This is essentially where the Army Corps is going to shape the scope of their study. So things and different parameters that they're going to include in the disposition study itself. So we're currently in this period where the public is able to engage and send comments in, and that goes through December 18th. So right now in scoping, this is the time to ask your questions about different considerations and concerns you have about some of those potential outcomes. So, what would happen in native fish populations if those structures were removed? Or what would happen, how much shoreline would be available that wasn't before? What kind of sediment maybe is built up behind the locks and dams that we need to learn more about and have tested and things like that. So right now until December 18th, we have that public engagement period to send in those comments and questions. And then that's when the Army Corps is going to take all of those comments and questions and shape their study and decide what and how deeply to study a lot of these different questions that the public has about these issues. They're going to go away for a little while, about a year and a half or so, and then they're going to come out and release their draft disposition report of all of the things that they studied. Then they're going to have another public engagement period where people are able to respond and say, hey, I disagree with your recommendation to remove the dams, or hey, I am very in support of dam removal and things like that, or, all of those different things. This time period is when they're going to make their recommendations to Congress. After that public engagement period, then they're going to release their final disposition report, where they send it to Congress, and then Congress has to take action. So either they'll, Congress will be like, yes, sure, we'll commission you to do this or not do this, or sign their approval, anything like that. But also, it might also instigate a lot of additional studies. So if, they recommend dam removal, for example, that would probably trigger a lot of environmental impact statements and other regulatory and very bureaucratic processes that would also need to be completed before anything actually changes. So to summarize this is a very long process. This is something that's going to be years in the making, and these structures aren't going to physically be changing anytime soon. However, this time period right now where we're able to really engage in this process and ask the questions that we have and voice the comments and concerns that we have is so crucial, because it has so many lasting impacts on the way that we understand the river. And so this is a really, really major consideration that we're thinking about and want to be really involved in as we proceed farther into this process. So one more question. Can anyone tell me what the goal of scoping is? Just scoping.
Well, I guess maybe estimates of costs, maybe, or which way they want to go in the process, or well, I guess it's maybe get the public's opinion of what they how to proceed, I guess.
Yes, you're getting there closer for the second part of that. Scoping is setting the parameters for the study itself, so that then they can make the recommendations based off of what they study. So scoping is where we are right now. Now is not the time to comment and say, I'm in favor of dam removal, or I'm really not in favor of dam removal. Now's the time to ask questions and help the Army Corps shape their study. So scoping, it's very confusing and it's very technical. And so we're trying to elaborate on that as much as possible. So it's a very weird technical process that we're working on communicating a lot more about. So all of this really ties us back together to this question about, what we see for the future of the river. This is a really, really big potential change that we could see. And it's something that we're really interested in thinking about, not only our relationship to the water now, but what future successional generations could understand the river to be like. And so with that, You can learn more. We have a whole suite of information, repeating things that I said in this presentation and getting into a lot more depth about these issues in the history as well at fmr.org/metrodams. And then you can also submit your comments now before the public engagement period ends on December 18th at fmr.org/scoping comments. So with that, thank you so much. I know I threw so much information at you, and I am more than happy to take questions and things like that now. For the first question, no barges use the locks anymore. That is correct. And then what about the purpose of keeping invasive fish from going up the river? So invasive carp is a really major concern that we have on the Mississippi River, and we're actually taking legislative action this upcoming session to really try and get more funding to target this issue. But unfortunately, Lock and Dam number 1 and Lower St. Anthony Falls are not tall enough dams to actually prevent carp from moving further upstream. So it would be like a Band-Aid on the issue. And so Upper St. Anthony Falls, fortunately, is tall enough to prevent them from like jumping over it or traveling through. But we're also really interested in thinking about what like a really resilient and diverse and challenging ecosystem might present for when the carp were to move into this stretch of the river, and if that would be a lot more competitive and maybe prevent the carp from being so invasive to the degree that they are in that stretch of the river if we were to remove those structures and do some more of that restoration. So that's a really major consideration we have here too. For what would happen to navigable water levels if the dams were removed. So like I was saying with those visualizations and things like that too, the water level would drop. We'd have a lot more shoreline. We'd have a lot more boulders and islands and rapids and things like that. So it'd be a lot less lake-like in that way. And so if the removal did not have a bad effect, would the Army Corps remove them? Not necessarily. The Army Corps might keep them because they might want to sell it to maybe the highest bidder, depending on who wants it. If a hydropower company really, really wants these structures and would pay a lot to continue maintaining them, they may not end up removing them. But it is a possibility that they could decide that it is in their best interest to take these structures out for how the costs and benefits kind of work out over time. How much energy would be lost if hydropower was removed? So this is a really good question. That is right. So we have estimated, I think it's about 26 to 28 megawatts of power that are being generated between Lower St. Anthony Falls and Lock and Dam number 1. That powers about 4,000 homes. So that's a pretty significant amount of hydropower that's doing a lot of that work. But at the same time, with some of the expansions that other companies and energy providers are doing in other types of renewable sectors, 28 megawatts is actually a very small amount of energy to be generated. So we're really interested in learning more about how that could be replaced and making sure that that's a really viable and important option at this time too. Does the university draw power from the river? I know we have the steam plant. I'm not 100% sure how much the university uses, but either way, with hydropower and things like that I was saying, we really just want to make sure that it's being replaced with other forms of renewable energy. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to keep up with these. These are great questions. Given any actual physical changes many years away, is the Corps responsible or committed to maintaining the structures until there is an approved plan of action? Yes, so they do have to, they will continue maintaining and operating them until Congress commissions them to not do that anymore. They will continue maintaining and operating the locks until that actually changes. They may not put a lot of effort in. You know, I don't know if you've like seen Lock and Dam #1 recently. There's like plants are kind of overtaking it. Cement is crumbling a little bit. They don't look great. So they'll continue maintaining them and making sure that, you know, minor things and whatever is still being taken care of, but there are very few people working there. They're not functioning more than they really need to at this time. Would the rowing clubs have to relocate, and where would that be? They likely would need to relocate their clubs to where more pool-like structures are for water. It could be, you know, farther upstream. It could be to other lakes. It could be to other areas in this vicinity, but it would probably be very difficult for rowers specifically to navigate. And we've actually, I met Fran at, was it I'm forgetting the name of your group.
The Inland Sea Kayakers.
Inland Sea Kayakers, thank you. So I met Fran at one of their meetings, and then my supervisor also has been talking to the Minnesota Rowing Club or the Minneapolis Rowing Club about this too. So they're very, very informed about this and are very involved in this process too.
There's also the university has rowing club,
Yep.
rowing team. So it's not only Minneapolis, but the U of M.
Yeah. We've also been speaking with some folks about that too. So there's been a range of responses to it. Obviously, moving multi-million-dollar facilities is not ideal. But there has been a range of responses from folks about what they think is best for the future of the river. If they remove the dams and the water levels drop, don't we run the risk of the river running dry with climate change? The river is already extremely low near Memphis. That's a really good question with climate change. I'm not as familiar with water levels and things like that, specifically in the Twin Cities and how some of those projections are supposed to come out with climate change. But one major consideration with this too, or not with these two locks and dams, but most of the Twin Cities water intake supply, like Minneapolis specifically, is above Upper St. Anthony Falls. And so that's something we could consider. I don't think the water levels themselves, we'd have less. It would just be more spread out and lower. It would just, the river ecosystem itself would interact differently than it does now. That's a really good question though, and you should ask the Army Corps that, because I do not know all of the science and the ways that they would be able to answer that and study that in a much more in-depth way than I could. You mentioned the possibility of locks being privately owned, which impacts public drinking water. How do we ensure the protection of drinking water not being commercialized and expensive? So again, that was with Upper St. Anthony Falls. Lower St. Anthony Falls and Lock and Dam #1. That's not as much of a consideration with, well, that stretch of the river isn't used for public water intake for drinking water. That was just with Upper St. Anthony Falls that was a potential change that could have happened. But that is not happening, to clarify that. And that was a really key point in that study where the public was involved and said, hey, don't do that. We are really not a fan of that. So drinking water with the privatization of that is not a consideration for Lower St. Anthony Falls and Lock and Dam #1. Privatization of those could be more effective on, have more of an effect on whether or not people can even go through the lock at all if it's privatized. You know, a hydropower company who owns the lock may not, have any reason to maintain the lock or open it. So it's something that we're really thinking about as well of like who different owners, like what types of different owners might want to do with the structures. Do they not use the lock to lower water level for checking checking bridges? Sorry. They actually did they did the drawdown a couple years ago at Upper St. Anthony Falls. So to do that and like check the maintenance of like Upper St. Anthony Falls Dam. So they can use the locks to lower the water level to check for things like that and do structural maintenance and things like that. But that is still under that commission purpose that the Army Corps has. So they could lower the water levels and like just have the locks fully open. But then, you know, that's kind of another possibility that we're considering of what it would mean for those locks to be still in place, but opened and used in different ways. There's a project at Upper St. Anthony Falls as well, where they're kind of considering what to do with the lock itself since it's not being used anymore and it's not open. So, you know, do they take it out and just leave the dam in place, or do they open it? Or they can't open it, but like, do they use different parts of it and make it into like a park-like structure or things like that, and kind of considering different ways that it could be used that are different than just this massive concrete structure sitting there. So I think that's all the chat questions. I hope I answered them. I know I'm not going into too much detail. I know I'm throwing a lot of information out there right now. So any other questions or comments?
So the biggest question I have is for our comments is to go to that website that you had listed by December, whatever the date was.
Yes.
Okay.
I just put that in the chat.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If they were to remove the locks and dams, what might be the implications of what might be in the sediment behind them?
That is a great question. So sediment is also a really major consideration here. They've estimated I can't give an exact number. There's a lot. There are like millions of cubic tons of sediment built up behind lock and dam number 1 at this point. And we don't exactly know what's in it either at this point. And so that's where that would be a really major consideration for dam removal, is what to do with that sediment and where it would need to be disposed of, how it might be used and things like that. So that's one of the major questions that we're asking during this comment period to have studied is how much sediment is there, and what's in it? Is it polluted or not? You know, would it be safe to release some of that into the water below, and like what would that mean for locks farther downstream? So that is a really major consideration that we have as well. And we don't exactly know what that means at this time. That's something that we really need to be studied, especially in order for us to have a stance on this issue too. So does that fully answer your question for now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Just one, well, this might be kind of, isn't the water used for Minneapolis water supply just upstream from the St. Anthony Falls, and would dropping the water levels cause a problem there? And there's a couple areas too. I think the flour mills use that water too, and some of the downtown, they use them actually, I think, in their air conditioning or something.
Yeah, so
a lot of uses for the river, you know, under its current state, I guess, whatever.
Yeah, so what would really have the most change with the water levels dropping would be the stretch between the falls themselves, like beneath the falls, down to where the Ford Dam is right now. So there wouldn't really be a big change. There wouldn't really be a big change above the falls and like where that drinking water intake is. That wouldn't be affected by it. The drop in water would just be below the falls, down that stretch of the river. So those things shouldn't actually be impacted too much by it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. If the level stays the same, I guess, yeah, or similar.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
speaking mainly of what the rowers use, the several rowing clubs, and it was just the mid-October where they had a large regatta called the Head of the Mississippi, where they had people, Canadians, huge numbers of people that come from far and wide using that stretch of the river. So it's just going to be a shame if that goes away.
Yeah, that would be one of the groups that would have the most change for them in the way that they interact with the water, which is unfortunate. It's just, it's a really big question of access in that way. And, the folks that use it now and the way that they have that relationship changing, and then, who might benefit or lose from that over time as well with those structures. So that's a really major part of what we're thinking about, and also what's been really meaningful for us to not have a stance yet on this issue too, because we know that this is really a really difficult and complex decision, and so that's why we haven't come out with a stance on it yet, not only because of the things that we need studied, but because there's a lot of different ways that people interact with this, and we want to be cognizant of that too as we make our decisions.
And without having barge traffic there, that's fairly new.
Yeah.
So, all right. Interesting. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Maddie, it's been wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you.